That's you recording, but not my recording, correct?
Correct. Oh, look, I can allow you to record. There we go. I just gave you permission to record.
Okay, let me see what's going on here.
It's by your name in the participants.
Let's see, stop video, rename, video pin, half view. Okay.
So go ahead and if you click on record again, I gave you permission to just click on record.
Okay. Okay, it says, I think I'm recording. Notice the word I think.
Usually you'll have a little cloud by your name and it'll have a little red dot in the center.
I don't see anything.
Okay, click on record again.
Okay.
And they'll edit this out when Daniel goes through it.
Right. Okay, I've clicked on record. It doesn't say give me permission, but
it shows you recording.
Okay. Well,
it does.
Then. All right, now let's see if I can get the PowerPoint back. Hi, everybody. Well, everybody's getting on board. I hope you all have had a good week.
We're not muted. Hi, Fred.
Hi. I'm a significant distance away. In fact, it's actually almost 3 o'clock my time. I'm up in the Eastern time zone.
It is ours too. It's almost 2. Yeah.
Yeah. You all know where Gatlinburg, Tennessee is, Pigeon Forge?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Okay, well, that's where I am. I have when I say tiny, I mean tiny little cabin, about 600 square feet, but it's just outside of Pigeon Forge.
You're just...
Yeah, it sits on a ridge line, so I've got a nice view out of the deck, and I enjoy it. It was a nice place for Bonnie and I to come to, and obviously I'm up here by myself now, but fond memories here.
When Misha was in high school, her band went to Gatlinburg for the Great Smoky Mountains Music Festival and took first place in their division.
Wow. Hey, let's find out how old Misha is. What year was that? Do you have any idea?
93, wasn't it?
Misha?
No, I think it was my sophomore year.
She graduated in 94.
94, 92. Okay, well, we bought the cabin in 2009, and in 92, 93, we came up to Gatlinburg for literally a 2-week vacation, longest we'd ever spent up here at that time. And that was just before we went to China. And it was a good year. Yeah, that was a while ago.
Yeah.
A day or two.
Right. At that time, I had never been abroad. And of course, the first time Bonnie and I went abroad was when we spent a year in the People's Republic of China in Nanjing, also formerly known as Nanking, China, which, by the way, is going to be part of the lecture today.
Ah.
So we're talking about the American Civil War. And now you all got to figure out how Nanking, China fits into the American Civil War. It does. Misha, by the way, you're the chair of this thing, so you just tell me when it's time to start.
All righty. We'll start about 2:05.
Okay.
I like to give latecomers a little 5-minute leeway.
Oh, I don't have a problem with that at all. I'll tell you one thing up here in the Eastern time zone, especially when you're on vacation, I don't know where the time goes. I got up this morning about 7:30, and the next thing I knew, it was 12:30. And I hadn't eaten breakfast yet. I mean, it's just, Bonnie and I always notice that. And weird. So I've just eaten breakfast about an hour ago. And that's a strange feeling.
That has happened to us a time or two.
Yeah. I think it really has more to do with by being on vacation than anything else. But yeah, you get up and you're not in any hurry. And by the time you kind of realize you hadn't had breakfast, it's noon.
Yeah.
In other words, don't hold your breath. We're bemoaning the fact that we had a question for our driver's license people, and the system is so broken now that literally all correspondence has to be taken care of through email.
I have a,
Even to answer a simple question, if you ask a question, you have to do it by email. And we did that, and they have responded with, we'll get back to you within 2 business days with an answer.
4 business.
4 business days, I'm sorry.
4 business days.
yeah, it's, I've got a really close friend of mine who is not necessarily even, he is absolutely less technologically advanced than I am, and I'm pretty grody on that. And so he doesn't have email. And so guess what? Every time that he needs to use an email, he uses mine.
Yep.
You know, he comes over and we type out whatever's needed to be done. A side effect of that is that I'm getting all kinds of advertisements
Yeah.
that are being sent. I mean, they're not bad. It's just, you know, more clutter. But they're always,
Annoying.
You've
they're being-
unwittingly opened yourself up to all the nonsense that goes with it.
oh yeah. And so, you know, dear Tommy, you know, we noticed that you like this and such. And so,
All right, it is now 2:05, and we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone for joining us today for lecture number 3 in the Civil War with Fred Bailey. I am going to be muting everybody during the presentation, and then afterwards, if anybody has any questions, then we can unmute you and you can ask, or you can type it in the chat box down below. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Fred.
well, thank you, Misha. Once again, let me say that I appreciate Misha. I appreciate the fact that, among other things, she's a very brave person. And what I mean by that is that I get the impression that technology, she's probably in advance with me, but it's a challenge, right, Misha?
Yes, yes, very much so.
But that's not a bad thing. It just means that sometimes we go to areas where it's useful, but it's just beyond what we're used to. And well, let's not talk about the present though. Let's go to the past. I am ecstatic. Well, yeah, I'd use that word, ecstatic. I am very happy that to have this opportunity to explore the American Civil War, but not to explore the American Civil War simply in jumping in and saying there was Fort Sumter and then there was Bull Run, etc., but really to talk about what the American Civil War was all about and the context of the American Civil War and how it still impacts us today. And the material that we're going to share over the next few minutes, where we look at the American Civil War in global perspective, is not just about what happened in the past, but it gives us a great deal of insight on what it continues to happen to our present day. Because in a great sense, the American Civil War helped to shape the kind of not only foreign policy, but interrelationship between nations that we still experience in our contemporary time. So with those thoughts in mind, let's look at the American Civil War in global perspective. And if you will, think of it as like playing chess, okay? That when you play chess, you've got all these pieces out on the board and they all have different values. But in the end, you're maneuvering to ultimately come to a goal, to a victory. And that's where we are with the American Civil War. It will involve a regional power. That'll be the United States of America. It'll involve a would-be nation. That's the Confederate States of America. It will involve the only superpower of the time. That's Great Britain. It'll involve a wannabe superpower, and that's going to be France. But it will also involve places like China, Mexico, Grenada, which is the modern day country of Colombia, and a portion of Grenada, which we call Panama. In other words, it's going to involve things that are literally all over the globe, and in such a way that the American Civil War is going to impact things all over the globe and require people to maneuver with the consideration of what you do in the Americans, in context with the American Civil War, will affect you and your foreign policy, not only between the United States and perhaps the Confederate States of America, but as it relates to the British province of Canada, markets with China, trade routes, and all kinds of other interesting and important diplomatic principles as well. So let's enter now into this discussion of the American Civil War in global perspective. And that's interesting. Here we go. The reason I say that's interesting, remember, Misha, I told you about how brave you are to be doing this sort of thing. I just hit for my screen to go to the next slide and nothing happened, but I found an alternative. And so my little heart will settle back down in a few seconds, okay? Notice the cartoon. This is based on a cartoon that appeared in Harper's Weekly very early, just before the American Civil War began, in February 16, 1861. And anticipating that a major world conflict was about to occur, that being the conflict, the Civil War between the North and the South, the cartoon is based on the idea of the American eagle, the British lion, and what they call the French cock or rooster. Now, why is France represented by a rooster? Well, it's because of their leader, Napoleon III, who seemed to act like a rooster, all bluff and noise, and yet at the same time full of mischief. And so it was pretty easy to portray him as a super well-dressed rooster, kind of messing everything up in the chicken yard. And so the cartoon was entitled The Crippled American Eagle, the Cock and the Lion. And of course, the crippled American eagle is that it's being weakened by the possibility of the American nation being divided. And so as the English lion and the French rooster, the French cock, began to look at the situation, they began to chide this American eagle that is now wounded. And so in a very condescending way, the lion says, "Why, Brother Jonathan." The term Brother Jonathan was the antebellum term that today we would use the term Uncle Sam. But Uncle Sam had not yet become a significant symbol of America. It was there, but it was in the background. Instead, this diminutive term, Brother Jonathan. And Brother Jonathan was a character who was young, was brash, and could sometimes overstep his bounds and get in trouble. And that's the point of the cartoon. For a long time, you've been brash and you've made a lot of noise, but now that you're hurt, the wise old English lion says, "Why, Brother Jonathan, you don't look so fierce as you used to. So how about that Monroe Doctrine now?" The Monroe Doctrine had been bothering the English because Americans had said, we don't want European nations messing with American affairs. And while we Americans like to think of the Monroe Doctrine as our protecting the Western Hemisphere, in truth, the intent of the Monroe Doctrine was to make us dominant in the Western Hemisphere. It was our sphere of influence. We are a regional power. And as a regional power, we want to say to other nations, stay out of that region. We have the right to dominate. And so the English line is saying, you upstart, how about that Monroe Doctrine now that you're crippled? And in the same way, the French cock says, well, yes, my good Johnston, what think you of privateering under the present circumstances? Obviously, my attempt at a French accent turned out to be more Southern. In either case, it was rather bad. But yes, my good Johnston, what do you think about privateering under the present circumstances? And where'd that come from? To understand that, you've got to go all the way back to the administration of John Adams, and in the 1790s, when we fought an undeclared naval war with France, a very important undeclared naval war. France was taking us for granted. France in the XYZ affair was treating us as a second-class power. And so without formally declaring war, John Adams authorized the American Navy, the first time the American Navy fought a foreign war, and the USS Constitution and some other frigates were successful in fighting French frigates. The American Navy did very well, but it was only a very small Navy and a couple of victories. But on the other hand, privateers. Privateer is kind of like a pirate, but he's legal. He's been given papers that said, in the name of the United States, you have the right to be a warship, and any of the enemy's combatants that you capture, you can sell for a profit. And so that's what a privateer is. And we unleashed our privateers on the French in the Caribbean, and so disrupted French trade that the French eventually agreed to negotiate with the United States, leading to something called the Convention of 1800. And in essence, the French admitted that messing with the United States was a bad thing. So it remained under the French skin. And the French were very upset going all the way back to the late 1790s and then the Convention of 1800 that they had been done in by this upstart power and its use of privateers. But now, as the United States is facing a possible war, and as the United States is facing the possibility of privateers being used to attack American merchant ships, the French are saying, why, yes, my good Jonathan, what do you think about privateers under the present circumstances? So England and France were looking forward to teaching the upstart United States a couple of things about foreign policy and how to be dealing with the real powers, the superpower England and the wannabe superpower France. But as we begin to talk about this, we're going to have to see what England and France, as well as the United States, was interested in, not just in terms of the crisis developing between the North and the South, but in terms of the entire globe. And if we're to understand what England and France and even the United States was interested in the entire globe, we need to begin not in Europe, not in North and South America, but all the way over in Asia. The world was focused on China. The world was focused on China and had been focused on China for a very long time. Think about it. Just give it a thought for a second. 1492, what was Columbus trying to do? He was trying to reach Japan and China. And he had no idea that there were two continents, what today we call North and South America, in his way. But he was sailing to the west, to where the sun set, in the belief that if he could sail all the way around the globe, he would end up in China and thus find a new route to the riches and to the products that China possessed. And so China then becomes the focus as far back as roughly 1500. And now more than 3 centuries later, 3.5 centuries later, it is still the focus of world attention. As a matter of fact, as we began to look at China, there are 3 things that are happening in China at about the time of the American Civil War that is catching world attention. The first were the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842, followed by something called the Taipei Rebellion, a kind of civil war that was going on in China. And that's going to be roughly 1850 to 64. I was having trouble reading my own writing. For the record, you see I'm wearing glasses. Well, the reality is that I'm going to have laser surgery pretty soon, so everything's a little blurry for me. But the Taipei Rebellion of 1850 to 1864, playing a significant role at the same time that we Americans are fighting the Civil War. But importantly, even as all these events are occurring, the reason that Europeans and Americans are interested in China has names, and those names are silk, tea, sandalwood, China ware, spices from Southeast Asia and India, and opium. Opium is critically important. We'll look at all of these in a few moments now. So, by the way, do you notice the ship there with a billowing sail? That's called a China clipper or a tea clipper, or if you really want to know the truth, an opium clipper. And they were the fastest sailing ships ever developed. This is the height of technology of wood and sail. And it took about 3 months. In other words, once you left, say, Hong Kong, to get to England or to New York either, was a sailing time of roughly 3 months. Or if you want to do a turnaround, somebody in, say, London in January has to anticipate where the market's going to be at best in July in order to anticipate a ship going all the way to Hong Kong, making a quick turnaround, and coming all the way back in a mere 90 days each way. But that was so much faster than had previously been done. So again, technology, trade, and what you can pick up in trade is really focused on China during this period of time. Okay. The Opium Wars. What were the Opium Wars all about? Prior to roughly about 1820, China was sucking silver bullion out of Europe tremendously. In the 1500s, Spain in particular became super wealthy by discovering silver mines and gold mines in the Americas. And so silver and gold bullion made its way to Spain, and then Spanish trade sent that all across Europe. But Europe was interested in the kinds of things that could be bought in China. The problem with the China market was then, to a great extent remains today, that there's very little the Chinese want that we Westerners have to sell. I'll give you a simple example. 30 years ago, I spent a year in China, and I remember much earlier when the Coca-Cola company got the franchise, and they were so excited because if just one Chinaman drank one Coke a day, you know, the wealth in that was fantastic. Well, it turned out the Chinese don't like Coca-Cola. So everybody that buys Coca-Cola in China are Westerners and tourists, especially since they want to keep the Coke cans that have the Chinese symbols on them. On the other hand, the Chinese do like two products that the Coca-Cola company sells. It likes what the Chinese call shibin, or we would call Sprite. They can't drink enough of that. And then there's another product that the Chinese love. It's called Tang. It's a powdery orange type drink that when the Chinese pour hot boiling water into it, makes for them a savory drink on a cold day. And they can't get enough Tang. I even developed a taste for hot Tang. And when I got back to America, I bought a jar of Tang to enjoy hot Tang again. And that jar pretty well sat in my cabinet for about 4 or 5 years before I finally threw it away. So the China market didn't have anything the Chinese wanted, but Americans wanted it. And the Chinese said, well, fine, we'll trade with you, but it's going to be cash up front and silver bullion only. So that all of there was a massive amount of hard currency, so to speak, flowing out of Europe and to a lesser extent out of North America, going to China, until finally, in the 1820s, the Dutch discovered that if you mix tobacco with opium, you can create a means of consuming opium that is cheap and allows you to use opium as a recreation. And all of a sudden, when it was introduced by the British into China, the Chinese found something that they craved. In fact, by roughly about 1830, 1 out of 3 people in China had a serious opium addiction. So the Chinese government engaged in a draconian, and when I say draconian, I mean draconian. You were given a choice as an opium addict of swearing off of opium or dying, being executed. But even that was only moderately successful, and it led to a drug war. But the essence of the drug war is between 1839 and 1842, the British were attacking the Chinese on the grounds that the Chinese were interfering with free trade so that the British could trade opium with China. And by the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, China admitted defeat and opened up almost all of China to trade, allowed the opium trade, and also allowed Western cultural influences to come in particular, the Western cultural influence of sending in Christian missionaries into China, which heretofore had been forbidden. And so the Opium Wars then helped set up the situation that's going to exist at the time of the American Civil War. And what was that situation that was occurring in China at about the time of the American Civil War? It was this thing called the Taipei Rebellion, which lasted from 1850 to 1864. The Taipei Rebellion began as a religious war. And I'll explain more about that rebellion a little later. But in essence, one Chinese, very charismatic, decided that he would combine the traditional religions of Taoism and Confucianism with Christianity And he created a new kind of religion in which he proclaimed that he was the younger brother of Jesus. And through a lot of other circumstances, this movement became so powerful that it ended up being a rebellion in which the followers of the Taipei Rebellion ended up really conquering about 2/3 of China and threatened to bring down the Qing dynasty. And that was occurring between when it began in 1850 and when it was finally crushed in 1864. And the Europeans, toward the end, became very involved with this because it was interfering with that trade which the Europeans desired so strongly. So this Taipei Rebellion was having a powerful influence not only on what was happening in China, but it was interfering with the trade that the English and the French in particular, and to a lesser extent the Americans, were engaged in order to get things like silk, tea, sandalwood, chinaware, and opium. Let me just say a word about opium here. Several years ago, doing some research, in this case at what was then Memphis State University, I came across a whole set of ledger books from a wide variety of pre-Civil War grocery stores. And this is where people would charge things and they'd list how much you charged and what you were purchasing. And opium, you could purchase it in the store and you wanted to purchase it. Let's suppose that you're a female and you're pregnant and very soon you're going to be in a great deal of pain as you enter into travail, ready to deliver the child. Well, a pinch of opium, usually mixed with alcohol called laudanum, which made a product called laudanum, greatly reduced the childbearing. And if you were wealthy enough, you could even use opium recreationally. The fictitious Sherlock Holmes sniffed opium. Queen Victoria could hardly start her day without a pinch of opium because it was relaxing and it sort of soothed away the worries and you could face the day beginning. So the opium trade, both out of India and Burma into China and out of India and Burma across the ocean to America, became quite important. And so China then becomes a focus. It has a lot of things that Westerners want and not much of a market except in the area of opium. But then in terms of cultural expansion of Christianity, for example, a tremendous number of religions, both in England and America, began to promote missionaries to go to China, to convert the heathen Chinese to religion. Well, in order to appreciate this trade, understand that control of trade routes became critical. And here we need to understand that in the 1850s and today, there are 6 major choke points of trade. And it helps to explain a lot that's going to happen in the American Civil War. So let's do a quick review of the 6 major choke points of trade. And all of them center on how to get to China. If you're in China, let's say that you own an English tea clipper that's sailing out of Hong Kong. What the English tea clipper will do, it will sail southward to the South China Sea, and there you have the first choke point of trade, the islands that surround the South China Sea. It was a place where pirates were abundant because they knew that wealthy ships filled with all kinds of trade goods and silver bullion going one way would be coming through. And it was important that those pirates be taken care of. And that's why the British established one of their important trading points at a place called Singapore. Singapore becomes the British fortress from which ships, some of them English, but more of them controlled by what was called the British East India Company, which was kind of a sovereign nation in and of itself, a weird place. But the British East India Company sent warships into that area to suppress the pirates. In fact, the first warships that were ironclads and steam driven were commissioned in 1840, not by the British government, but by the British East India Company. And the whole purpose of those warships was to give them an edge in fighting the pirates in the South China Sea. So the South China Sea becomes one of the 6 choke points of trade. Typically then, if your China clipper made it through that choke point of trade, you have 2 choices. One choice is a very long journey around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. And the Cape of Good Hope becomes another choke point of trade. And you'll notice that South Africa and the Cape of Good Hope becomes a British colony for that very reason. Because again, the British could establish naval squadrons there to protect that choke point of trade. But there was another possibility, a shorter journey, but a little more complicated. And that shorter journey took you up the Red Sea to the Isthmus of Suez. Now notice I said Isthmus of Suez and not the Suez Canal, because the Suez Canal did not exist at that time. It's built later, past the American Civil War. And oddly enough, it's the French that built it, but that's the rivalry between France and England, as England is a superpower and France is the superpower wannabe. But the Isthmus of Suez was a small stretch of land that connected the Sinai Peninsula to the rest of Africa. And so ships would sail up the Red Sea or down the Red Sea from the Isthmus of Suez. And then they would have to transport goods across the short distance of that isthmus to be loaded on additional ships to sail across the Mediterranean. So you could shorten the journey, but shortening the journey meant that your ship has to unload at Suez, cross a land bridge, and then load onto other ships to make your way on into France or Spain or Italy or England. And of course, in order to get out into the Atlantic, the next choke point is Gibraltar. Gibraltar, which is an island located on the very end, the western end of the Mediterranean Sea, and guards the entrance and exit of the Mediterranean Sea. And who controls Gibraltar by the time you get to the American Civil War? The English. The English have Singapore, the English have South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, the English have Gibraltar. They're controlling the choke points of trade during this period of time because they are the superpower. On the other hand, there is an alternative route where you cross the Pacific Ocean, but then if you cross the Pacific Ocean, you've got to go through the Straits of Magellan at the very tip end of South America. A very long journey, but it is an alternative route to going through the directions that we just discussed. And if you're coming to the eastern portions of North America, to places like Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, Charleston, South Carolina, then the route you would take you down through the Straits of Gibraltar. Down through the Straits of Magellan. What's the problem with the Straits of Magellan? The most dangerous oceans in the world, typically called a graveyard of ships, is a graveyard of ships to this day. If you're one of these adventure travelers, I'm a traveler and I like a moderate amount of adventure, but I have no desire to go to Antarctica. But if you have this desire to be an American tourist and to do an adventure travel and go to Antarctica, you typically also go through the Straits of Magellan. And every so often you find out that there are these ships that sink or find themselves in distress, and the passengers have to be rescued even today. And so again, you can do that, but it's dangerous. It's dangerous physically, it's dangerous financially. And again, who controls that? Well, technically, Argentina and Chile control it, but in point of fact, the British had a few small islands called the Falklands, and they established a naval squadron on these tiny, rough, islands in the far South Atlantic Ocean called the Falklands. And even as late as the late 20th century, what do the English do? They fight a war to keep control of the Falkland Islands, because that controls one of the choke points of trade that goes through the Straits of Magellan. Now, by 1850, the Straits of Magellan had taken on an additional importance. In 1850, the Straits of Magellan take on an additional importance because, to everyone's surprise, out in a place called California, which was about as remote and worthless a place as you could possibly imagine, a massive amount of gold was discovered not far from San Francisco and to the north of San Francisco. And gold fever swept the globe. And this is not to talk about why it sweeps the globe and encourages Irishmen and Germans and the French, all of whom are in unsettled situations due to war and famine. And in the United States, the unemployed and the underemployed in the areas around, say, New England and New York and the American South, all of whom all of a sudden hear about this wonderful place called California, where gold could just be had by sweating, and the dust in the air would attach your sweat. Fantastic stories were told, and some of those fantastic stories had a kernel of truth in them. But the only way to get from New York or from Ireland or from Germany to California was to go all the way around the tip of South America and the dangerous Straits of Magellan, or there was another alternative, and that alternative was the Isthmus of Panama. And again, you notice I use the word isthmus. An isthmus is a narrow neck of land between two large bodies of water. And Panama is about 40 miles wide. It's part of the nation of New Granada, which becomes the nation of Colombia. And it is prime real estate. Whoever could build a canal across that short 40-mile stretch of land is going to control one of the wealthiest, busiest, and most important choke points of trade in the world. And there were only a handful of people that were interested in that, and they have names. Their names are Great Britain, France, Russia, Spain, and the United States. All of them want to control this former Spanish colony that becomes the nation of New Granada and the future nation of Colombia, and its little isthmus called the Isthmus of Panama. And the Isthmus of Panama becomes important in many of the considerations that are going to happen internationally as it relates to the conflict between the United States of America and the breakaway republic, the Confederate States of America. And so those are the 6 points of trade that exist. But notice the importance of China and the possibility of enhancing the trade with China, as well as with California, if we could somehow do something about crossing Panama. What's the problem of crossing Panama, by the way? Well, yes, you could do a transshipment. And by the mid-1850s, there would even be a railroad built across there. But Panama was a place of tropical diseases, cholera, which is not a tropical disease, but cholera killed tens of thousands of people as they tried to make their way to the gold fields in California. And so it's a place of disease, as thousands upon thousands of people either head west toward California or east with gold bullion, making them susceptible. It was also a place where man's inhumanity to man in so many different forms existed as you tried to cross Panama. And so the solution is to build a canal. But who's going to have the right to build that canal? That's an issue that we're going to deal with. But now let's focus. Let's move over to Europe. And I want to focus on Britain and France, because Britain was the superpower of the era, and France, which had once been a superpower, wanted to become a superpower again. So it was what I call a superpower wannabe. And the American Civil War places some interesting elements into England and France's quest for world domination. Now, in both cases, with England and France, I'm going to start with the Confederate States of America. And that has nothing to do with any particular favoritism toward the USA or CSA. It's just a little easier to line out the situation with the Confederate States of America as it relates to England and France, whereas the relationship between England and France and the United States requires a little bit more explanation. So we begin with the CSA, Confederate States of America, and then we can switch around and look at Britain and the USA and the issues involved. But when you're dealing with Britain as it's looking at how to deal with the Confederate States of America, here are the issues that are involved. First, the issue of cotton. Do you remember in our first lecture when we talked about Mississippi seceding from the Union? And when the Mississippi Justification for Secession was published, they began immediately with the phrase, "We believe in the efficacy of slavery, the greatest financial institution in the world, the basis of world trade." Well, while that was a little bit of an overblown statement, it wasn't too much of an overblown statement. Cotton was king. And England depended a great deal on cotton. We're going to go into that. England also had an armament industry, producing guns, producing military ships. And that armament industry is something that's going to be very important to the Confederate States of America. So a viable market for British goods of war existed wherever there was a war. And as the war developed in the United States and the breakaway republic of the Confederate States of America, that meant that both the United States and the Confederate States are going to buy significant numbers of arms from the English. The Confederate States are going to buy a great deal more arms from the English because the United States is manufacturing arms. It simply needs more arms than it can manufacture. So one of the considerations of England as it's looking at the possibility of whether or not to recognize the Confederate States of America is this market in arms and the potential continuation of a market in arms and alliances and a puppet state perhaps that England has to consider as it's weighing the scales of what to do as it relates to the American Civil War. And of course, long-standing was a rivalry between the United States and England. And then there were societal issues within England as it relates to the American Civil War. A conflict between the English aristocracy, which was politically very powerful, and the British working class, and even more important, the British middle class, which was gaining political power, and how that is going to affect the British government as it tries to decide what to do, what side to take, which side to encourage during the American Civil War. King Cotton. You've probably heard the term King Cotton. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and every May we had the Cotton Carnival. By the way, the Cotton Carnival still exists, but the center of cotton in the United States has shifted from the American South to, of all places, Arizona. And so now Arizona has the Cotton Carnival every spring, which to me is kind of weird. But with irrigation, Arizona actually is the largest cotton producing state in the Union. Now, having said that, cotton fed textile mills. It fed textile mills in New England. You might remember last semester we talked about, our last unit, we talked about the alliance between the lords of the lash, that's the owners of plantations and slaves, and the owners and the lords of the loom in New England. But the same kind of alliance also existed with England. Northern England, especially the area around Manchester, was the largest textile producing area in the world. Largest textile producing area in the world. And the English depended upon a southern cotton. 80% of the English production of textiles, of cloth, came from cotton produced by slaves in the American South. And 1 out of every 4 factory workers in England, 25% of the factory workers in England, depended upon the cotton trade. Cotton coming into England created prosperity. It created markets. England in general and the area around Manchester and Liverpool in particular, which is northern England, were absolutely dependent upon what was called King Cotton. Now, where does this phrase King Cotton come from? Initially, it came from a person by the name of David Christie. Now, David Christie is probably not a name that most of us have heard of. The phrase King Cotton was used in a famous speech on the American Senate floor by Senator Hammond of South Carolina, but he got that idea from reading the analysis, the book written by David Christie of Cincinnati, Ohio. Christie's an interesting character. On the one hand, he sympathized with the black race. But on the other hand, he was a racist. He was really promoting the settlement of Liberia. In other words, the part of Africa that was settled by slaves, recolonization from the New World to Africa. But in doing so, don't think of him as being anti-slave. Instead, he was anti-free black. It was his view that blacks prospered under slavery. It was his view that the tropical and semi-tropical crops such as sugarcane, which is tropical, and semi-tropical cotton, which requires a long, hot growing season, is best produced by black labor, by people of African descent. And that was his interpretation. That was his view. And so even though he is a supporter of black colonization in the New World, what he's trying to do is to reduce the free black population because he believed that free blacks and Anglo-Saxons, Caucasians, could not live together in harmony. And so notice what he says. He's attacking the abolitionists for their failures. And he's saying that King Cotton, in the end, proves far more powerful than 30 years, from the 1820s to the 1850s, of abolitionist agitation. The very thing necessary to overthrow of American slavery, abolitionism, has been left undone, while those essentially to its prosperity, plantation agriculture, has continued in the most active operations. So that now, after more than 30 years, from the 1820s to 1850, we may say emphatically, cotton is king and its enemies have been vanquished. And so he develops this idea, this concept, that should the South leave the Union, its power generated by this fantastically profitable crop would be sufficient to gain foreign support, to almost literally bribe England to support a breakaway republic. And then the British armament industry. We're going to look at British arms. The British Enfield rifle and the American Springfield rifle were almost duplicates. Now, if you read the literature, it's a little hard to determine which came first. The Springfield rifle, which was produced by the United States Army at its Springfield Arsenal in New England, or the Enfield rifle that is produced in England. And the reason it's a little complicated, and you'll find historians who say the Springfield is a copy of the Enfield, and you'll find other scholars who say the Enfield was a copy of the Springfield, has to do with patents, and it has to do with the exchange of manufacturing tools, so that some of the tools that the Enfield company used to produce Enfields, they had purchased from the Springfield Armory. And conversely, some of the tools that were used to produce the Springfield rifle, which was the principal rifle of the Northern soldiers during the Civil War, were purchased from the Enfield company in the 2 decades prior to the American Civil War. So it doesn't really matter which preceded the other. But the reality is that the principal rifle used by Northern soldiers, the Springfield, and the principal rifle that will eventually be used by the soldiers of the Confederate States of America were almost exactly the same. There's some minor differences in gun sights and things like that, but they were almost inexchangeable. And so in the case of the British will make Enfield rifles and they will sell them to the United States to make up the difference in need between the Springfields that Americans were producing for Northern soldiers only and weapon production coming out of the Enfield company. But for the Confederacy, almost 75% by 1863 of the small arms used in the Confederate States of America were rifles imported from England, from the Enfield company. And by the way, just a little interesting footnote, at the siege of Vicksburg, in which Grant forced the Confederate Army to surrender, the Confederates were better armed with more modern weapons than the Union soldiers had. Because the best weapons that the Union soldiers had always went to the soldiers in the East, things like the Army of the Potomac in its march on Richmond. And so the army of approximately 30,000 men that Grant had surrounding Vicksburg had basically the cast-off arms of the American military. So that when the Confederates surrendered, Grant had this mother lode of Enfield rifles, and he immediately ordered all of his soldiers to bring their rifles to turn them into the quartermaster and to draw Confederate Enfield rifles, which were much better quality. So not only do you have the surrender of the Confederate Army, but you have the surrender of these much better weapons, the Enfield, from what Grant's army had, as he had the cast-off military wear of the largesse of the American military. This is a little footnote. Traditionally, however, there was a long series of rivalries between the United States and England. Obviously, the rivalry of the American Revolution, of course, but the War of 1812. Nothing was settled by the War of 1812. The only thing that really comes out of the War of 1812 between England and the United States is the English realization that it's better to placate the Americans than to fight them. It's better to placate the Americans than to fight them. What the English learned from the War of 1812 is you can be victorious and you can fight a war in America, but you've got long, long lines of logistics, and it's expensive and it's difficult to fight a war against this regional power, the United States of America. And so there was this conflict constantly on one issue after another from 1815 to 1860 between the United States and England, a constant sense of rivalry. And remember, what did I say about the United States? The United States is a regional power. A regional power. England as a world power would love to get rid of this irritant called the regional power of the United States. And the birth of the Confederate States of America would greatly reduce the power of the United States and make dealing with things in America so much easier for the English. consideration. But then, as the English considered that, there were English problems at home. And the English problems at home, simply stated, was leftovers from the French Revolution. That's correct, leftovers from the French Revolution. If you followed the public broadcasting season and the BBC's productions of the series on Victoria, you occasionally saw references to the Chartist movement. The Chartist movement was a kind of class warfare between the English workers and the factory owners and the wealthy in England. And throughout the 1830s and 1840s, England was constantly afraid that a French Revolution type activity was developing in their own country. And in fact, two things happened as a result of that. The English began to take into consideration the unrest that existed among the working class, for whom they had absolutely no desire to give the right to vote. The Chartists were demanding universal manhood suffrage, in which all men, regardless of property, regardless of wealth, women are not included, all men should have the right to vote, which means the possibility of controlling Parliament. But the English people in power had no desire to give that to a bunch of ignorant working class people as they saw it. On the other hand, there was a small group of Englishmen, well educated, diligent, hardworking, who also wanted the right to vote. And that's the beginning of the Victorian middle class. Maybe 10, maybe 15% of the population. But in response to what was happening in the Chartist movement, the franchise was expanded during the 1830s to allow this middle class, much smaller property holding requirement, to have the right to vote. Now, in theory, they're only about 10 to 15% of the population. But in close elections, whoever controlled that 10 to 15% of the population controlled the outcome of the election. And the British middle class was heavily influenced by a religion other than the Church of England. And the religion other than the Church of England that had powerful influence on the English middle class was Methodism. That off branch, led by the Wesleyans. And the Wesleyans, especially John Wesley, had experienced slavery in America and had been appalled by what they saw. And so British abolitionism and English Methodism, both of them existed among the same people with a white-hot religious fervor. And so as the British ruling class looked at the stability of England politically, they had to take into consideration, do we go with the British aristocracy and the British manufacturers, who see nothing but good coming out of the Confederate States of America and future markets and a puppet state and so many other things and a weakened United States? Or do we take into consideration that we could all be voted out of office because we've upset this middle class who holds that tiny balance of power that controls whoever ends up being in power in the government in England? And so even though the aristocracy and even though the business class strongly favored the Confederate States of America, the possibility of recognizing the Confederacy and causing a rebellion among the powerful abolitionist elements of the Methodists weighed heavily on the British decision whether or not to support the Confederate States of America. And so now, what considerations does England have as it relates to the United States of America? Those are the considerations that you have to think about when you're deciding whether or not to recognize and decide with the Confederacy. What are the arguments that say we really need to pay attention to the United States of America, and this may keep us from recognizing the Confederate States of America? Well, there were a number of things. Just to list you 1, 2, 3, 4, Canada, which was vulnerable to the United States. Treaties, and especially treaties that relate to the Isthmus of Panama between the United States and England. Principles of international law. Now that sounds like something that you might hear being done at The Hague in the World Court. Well, it is the kind of thing that would be done today at The Hague in the World Court. The principles of international law that can lead to violence or can lead to peace. And the United States was very much active in debating these principles of international law and in conflict with England. And then lastly, American wheat and the English corn laws. American wheat and the English corn laws. So let's take a look at each one of those and see how they weighed heavily upon the British. Canada. This is a cartoon from a humor magazine called Punch. And by the way, you notice Lord Punch. Well, Lord Punch was this humorous figure who was often given the right to say things. I grew up on a marvelous magazine called Mad Magazine. And of course, the spokesman for Mad Magazine was Alfred Newman, whose famous slogan was, "What me worried?" Well, Lord Punch was kind of the Alfred Newman of Punch Magazine. But in this cartoon, you have the Prince of Wales, who was a young man at the time, the oldest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and who made his first international tour, his showing the flag for the British monarchy by a trip to Canada in 1860. Now, this is important because you want the Canadians to remain loyal to England, and the Canadians were talking about seeking some kind of independent status at the time. But at the same time, you want to send a message of peace to the United States because Canada is vulnerable. The United States has war plans to invade Canada. It had them in 1860. It still has them today. There's an episode of that marvelous TV series called The West Wing in which, in a humorous way, we're on the verge of war with Canada. And when the American spokesman said to the Canadian ambassador, "We don't have any plans to attack you," her military aide said, "No, we need to talk about this because we do." And finally, in response to the ambassador after seeing the war plans, she said, "Yes, we do indeed have plans to invade Canada. It's all printed out here, hasn't been updated since 1819, and the calligraphy is beautiful, but we do have plans to invade Canada." In 1860, the United States definitely had plans to invade Canada. In the event of a conflict with England, our way of defeating the English was to conquer Canada. The English were willing to defend Canada, but they knew the cost of doing it, the cost in terms of lives, and more importantly, the cost in terms of those long logistical lines that would go all the way back to England, which means very expensive. And so the English had to decide, if we recognize the Confederate States of America, that means that there's a high probability of war with the United States. And if there's war with the United States, we will have to defend vulnerable Canada. On the other hand, there's also this issue of the choke point of trade. Panama. Who has the right to build a canal there? And nations were willing to go to war for that right to build. Well, the United States and England were in a standoff. The United States wanted to build that canal. England wanted to build that canal. And what the two nations realized was that this debate over who gets to build that canal could cause war between the United States and Canada. So in 1850, the United States and Canada entered negotiations, and they came up with what was called the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. Now, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty is quite involved. But the short version of that treaty is that neither the United States nor England nor Britain would build that canal without the permission of the other. In other words, they didn't say we're not going to build a canal, but they did say that we're going to build that canal without going to war. And neither the United States nor England will build the canal without the permission of others. Well, you say, what about France and Russia? Well, Russia we took care of in a different way. Spain, who cared about Spain by this point in time, is far too weak. And the French had not yet gotten over the French Revolution. They were emerging as a superpower wannabe, and the French had their idea on a canal. And if you're familiar with the Panama Canal eventually being built, the first effort to build the Panama Canal in the 1880s will be the French, as the United States and England can't decide which one of us will do it. Notice the cartoon is in 1882, and it's dealing with the fact that England and France still can't, England, the United States still can't decide which has the right to build the canal. And meanwhile, the French are raising money to build the canal themselves. A little footnote on our contemporary world. China wants to build a canal through Nicaragua. Began in 2014. They were trying to raise the money and to deal all the dealings. And the Nicaraguan government, which has a strong socialist Marxist background to it, is quite willing to deal with China to build a canal across Nicaragua, which, by the way, makes far more sense than building a canal through Panama. But the United States has been able to, how shall I say it kindly, find rather sophisticated ways of saying to the Chinese, don't you dare. So that as of 2019, and now we're in 2020, the Chinese project, which they had agreed to with the Nicaraguan government to build a canal, is on hiatus. It is not developing. But you can see that whoever controls that region controls a major choke point of trade. And the Chinese, in 2014, signed an agreement with Nicaragua to build the more natural canal that would cross Nicaragua. The United States, for reasons, wanted to prevent that. And we'll look at that reason in a moment. But now a couple of principles of international law. One of the principles of international law that's very important to the United States is something called freedom of the seas. Freedom of the seas. What freedom of the seas means that anytime you see an American flag or the flag of any other nation, that on the high seas, out beyond the national boundaries, a flag represents that country. Now, for the United States, we went to war over that issue. That's what the War of 1812 was all about, freedom of the seas. What's the background on that? The background on that has to do with the Napoleonic Revolution and England and France fighting for world domination during the Napoleonic Revolution, roughly 1800 to 1815. And in the course of this struggle, the English had a problem with sailors jumping ship, and many of them jumped ship to American ships. And so the British were in the habit of stopping American ships on the high seas and impressing off of those ships people they claimed to be British deserters. Many of them were. It's very hard to tell the difference between a British deserter and an American. They look alike, they sound alike, and well, in point of fact, it is very difficult to determine it. It's one thing, however, to board a merchant ship. But in 1807, the British ship Leopard stopped the American frigate Chesapeake on the high seas. And when the Chesapeake refused to allow the British commander to send sailors over to search his crew for deserters, the British ship opened fire, killed several Americans. And then the British forced the ship to surrender, and the British came on board, and they found a half dozen or so that they claimed were deserters. Incidentally, it took about 5 years for it all to go through the court system, and just before the War of 1812 broke out, they were eventually repatriated back to the United States. You can only imagine what happened to those men during that period of time. But at any rate, this Chesapeake Leopard affair, think about it. What if the Iranians in the Persian Gulf, stopped an American freighter, boarded it, and took several Americans off an American freighter today. What kind of reaction would we have? What kind of reaction should we have? Well, in the case of Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States of America, Jefferson did what he typically did in foreign affairs. He went. He didn't do anything of significance. And as a result, the British began to say, hey, you can board American ships and there's no punishment. Until finally they boarded so many American ships that this precipitated the War of 1812 to 1815, in which the United States went to war to say that there is freedom of the seas, and whenever there's a flagged ship, it cannot be boarded by another nation. It's an important principle. World trade couldn't exist without it. Second principle of international law is something that is uniquely American. In 1823, President Monroe issued a proclamation saying that the United States would not tolerate any future European colonization of the New World. You know, the situation of all these republics developing as they are breaking away from the Spanish Empire, and the United States is saying those republics are vulnerable, and the United States will not tolerate England or France or Russia. Russia, coming in from the Pacific, threatened to expand into those breakaway republics. The United States will not allow any European power to interfere with the sovereign policies that exist in the Western Hemisphere. Now, traditionally, if you go to high school, we present this as almost a humanitarian kind of thing on the part of the United States. It was not humanitarian. What the United States was really saying is, we're the power in the Western Hemisphere, and any colonization or any activity internationally that's going to happen, any trade problems and issues are going to be done with the influence of the United States. That's still the policy today. What happened when a so-called tin-horn dictator in Panama threatened to shut down the Panama Canal? George H.W. Bush, President of the United States, sent all of the resources of the American military into Panama, invaded it, created a new government friendly to the United States, and the Panama Canal remained open to trade for the world. And did the world complain about this aggressive activity of the United States? No, because the Western Hemisphere is the unique power sphere of the United States of America, going back to the Monroe Doctrine. But what does England think of it? What does France think of it? It's a complication they'd rather be without. Again, 1896, many years after the American Civil War, the United States is saying to England, the Monroe Doctrine, keep out. This is our area. We're regional power. And lastly, you have King Cotton from the South. Something that was creeping up on the English was the importance of American wheat. Wheat principally, wheat can be grown in the North and the South, but the difference is, why grow wheat when you can grow cotton or sugarcane, which is much more profitable? Prior to 1832, the English had what were called corn laws. Now that confuses Americans, because when we use the word corn, we're thinking about this this food that has a cob on it and wonderful yellow, sometimes white grains that you can boil and then eat with your teeth and have a wonderful time doing it. A little messy, but the word corn in England simply means grain. So if we said the English grain laws, that would make sense to an American mind. The English corn laws really is the English grain laws. But the English grain laws favored the English aristocracy, the people that owned those manor farms, such as was presented in the dramatic series Downton Abbey. The principal source of income was growing wheat. But in order to protect that wheat from cheaper grain, the the English Corn Laws virtually forbade the importation of wheat from any other country. You could only buy expensive wheat produced by English aristocrats. But by the 1830s, with this Chartist movement developing and this very unhappiness among the English workers were saying, listen, the capitalists aren't paying us enough. We can't buy bread. We're starving to death. We're not paid enough to do it. At that point, the English had two choices. One, raise wages, which the industrial capitalists didn't want to do. Or two, open up wheat to importation, in which case the price of bread would fall as cheaper wheat would be imported from the Ukraine and Russia, from Latin America, and principally from the northern part of the United States. And that was the option they chose to do. The Corn Laws were repealed, and by the time you get to the 1860s, about 1/4 of all the wheat coming into England came from outside. And by 1860, during the period of the American Civil War, a unique weather thing happened. There was a drought in Russia and the Ukraine, so their wheat production went down. There were droughts in various parts of Europe where wheat production went down. There was a blight in South America and wheat production went down. And so the main source of wheat from abroad became the United States of America. And so the English had to decide, if we support the Confederacy, we might get the Confederate cotton, which we need to keep our economy going. But at the same time, the Americans could then shut off the wheat, and we would have the situation of these workers who are on the verge of a French Revolution kind of situation, the Chartist movement, at least the antecedents of the Chartist movement. And remember, this is the England of Karl Marx, and Marx and others of his mentality were fomenting a kind of revolutionary spirit in England. The English were very worried about losing wheat coming in from America. So those are all the kind of complicated situations that the English had to consider as it related to the American Civil War. And then there was the French. I have been to France. I actually like Paris. I've been to other parts of France. I don't get them, but that's okay. They're French. I'm an American. We're different people. And so what can we say about the French in the American Civil War? Essentially, the French were a world power wannabe. They had lost a whole series of 18th century wars. That's the 1700s, culminating ultimately in the Napoleonic Wars that last up to 1815. And they've been fighting these wars between England and France for world domination. And in the end, England emerges, Great Britain emerges as a giant world power, and France collapses. And for quite a few decades, becomes a pitiful country until in the 1840s, you have the rise to power of a man named Napoleon III. And Napoleon III wanted to rebuild. He was kind of like a Mussolini who wanted to rebuild the Italian Roman Empire. But Napoleon III wanted to rebuild the French Empire. Napoleon III, and yes, there was a Napoleon II. That was the son of Napoleon I. But Napoleon II, basically his father said, I'm resigning at the end of, at the beginning of his first exile, and I turn the reins of government over to my son, who will become the new emperor. And he was kind of emperor for about 2 weeks until the victorious powers said, this is ridiculous, and they basically booted him out as well. So Napoleon III becomes emperor in 1852, but he's elected president in 1848. And in 1848, he is progressive. He has at his base the impoverished people, the impoverished voters of France. Victor Hugo, Les Miserables. If you're familiar with that novel and the suffering and the revolutionary spirit that appears in that novel. That's about France in the 1820s and the 1830s. And Victor Hugo was swept up with Napoleon III's vision. So that Victor Hugo, the writer of Les Miserables in 1848, is a supporter of Napoleon III as this powerful presidential figure who's going to restore prosperity to France, who's going to use building programs in Paris to give employment to the suffering poor, who has a number of successful European adventures, including one that's critical. He helps to unify Italy, but in process of helping to unify Italy, he makes sure that the papal estates, the states controlled by the Pope in Rome, remain independent of Italy. And why is that important? Because Napoleon III was a staunch Catholic. And as a staunch Catholic, he wanted the kind of political power that would benefit the Catholic Church. And not only power that would benefit the Catholic Church, but the political power that benefited from helping the Catholic Church. And you say, why did I go into this bit of religious dynamics? Because it's going to influence events that will eventually occur in Mexico, where the Catholic Church is very powerful. Did you follow all of that? Remember that there is a strong tie between Napoleon III, this rather flamboyant, brilliant, erratic French nationalist who wants to restore France's place in the sun and wants to rebuild. He has successes in Asia, he has his successes in Africa, and he has his eye on two of the major choke points of trade, Suez, and building a canal there, and Panama, and possibly building a canal there. Incidentally, what happens in 1856, 1857? England and France fight a war against Russia, the Crimean War. Why on earth would England and France cooperate to fight a war against Russia? And the answer is they were trying to keep Russia from exercising its ambitions to control the Suez region, which was one of the choke points of trade. Now you begin to see the importance of these choke points of trade and why things are being done diplomatically all around the world. But in our case, Napoleon III sees in the possibility of recognizing the Confederate States of America a weakened regional power, the United States. But then in 1862, there's something additional that's happening. Mexico. Mexico and the United States had fought a war, the Mexican-American War. As a result of that war, Mexico had an extremely difficult time rebuilding. It was unstable. Now, what I'm going to say next is an oversimplification. It's the best I can do to help explain what's happening in Mexico. In the long run, the political history of Mexico is a struggle between those elements of Mexico that are relatively conservative, and part of the conservatism is a powerful base of Catholicism. The Catholic Church is seen as a stabilizing force that keeps the peasants in line. And so the conservatives in Mexico tend to be overwhelmingly Catholic, and they're using their Catholicism to maintain a sense of structure and order and pacification. I mentioned Karl Marx a moment ago. Marx once used the phrase, religion is the opium of the people. And Marx is using that phrase as it relates to the institution of the Catholic Church and as it relates to the institution of the Church of England. He's living in London when he writes that phrase. And so in a very Marxian sense, the conservatives in Mexico see religion as a stabilizing influence, but the radicals see the Catholic Church as an opium, keeping the people from exercising their rights and seeking liberal prosperity that should be the rights of the people. So the opposition to the Catholic Church in Mexico is the secularist, the people who want to lessen the power of the Catholic Church so that liberals can come in and be able to engage in reform, to engage in agricultural reconstruction in terms of property and that sort of thing, redistribution of property, and nationalization of principal industries, such as the oil industry eventually. And so there is this conflict constantly in Mexico between the liberals, who tend to be secularist, and the conservatives, who tend to be Catholic. And as you get toward the early 1860s, the liberals are beginning to take control, but there's a sense of anarchy in Mexico. And so the conservatives decide that what Mexico needs is a good, strong, European-type leader, an emperor, someone on the model of, say, a Napoleon III, who recently helped establish the Papal States, even as he helped Italy unify. And that's Napoleon III. And so the conservatives in Mexico, heavily pro-Catholic, go to Napoleon III, and in what is really a kind of set-to drama, invite him to recommend an emperor who can come to Mexico and encourage the stability of Mexico and empower the Catholic Church as a stabilizing influence. And of course, that's exactly what happens. But in order to secure that emperor, France also agrees to send a significant number of troops to help put down the anti-Catholic revolution going on in Mexico. And that becomes the intervention between 1862 and 1867. Now, work with me on this. What else is France interested in? And the answer is, the other thing that France is interested in is, of course, the existence of a puppet state called Mexico, from which France can easily guard and protect that choke point of trade across the Central American Isthmus, either going through what is now Nicaragua or going across the Isthmus of Panama. And of course, who doesn't want to see this happen? Who has this Monroe Doctrine that says we don't want France to do this? The United States of America. But the United States of America will become embroiled in a titanic civil war between the United States and the breakaway republic, the Confederate States of America. It is a complication. So how does the United States and how does the Confederate States of America see the rest of the world as we're talking about the situation? Here's how. First, the Confederate States of America. Their situation is fairly easy to chart out. In the case of the Confederate States of America, they really have two immediate goals. Because after all, they're trying to create their own states, so their goals are immediate. First, diplomatic recognition, so that they can be recognized as a nation. And the most important places are Britain and France to recognize them. And then second, the armament necessary to fight this war. The South enters the war with not very much to fight with. And so arms and ships and war materiel can only be purchased abroad. And the purchase abroad means principally England and possibly France. The Confederate States of America had a goal of recognition from John Bull. John Bull is the Uncle Sam of England. And here, the Confederate States of America is not served well. Envoys, an envoy is an informal representative. Envoys are sent to England and France. In the case of England, James Madison of Virginia, former United States Senator, and John Slidell of Louisiana, again, a former United States Senator. Both are men of ability who have proven themselves excellent politicians, superior senators, who spoke well for the Southern cause, who had defended slavery, men of great ability, but their training in diplomacy was rather weak. And so, unfortunately for Jefferson Davis, as he sends Slidell and as he sends Madison to England, Slidell to France, he has chosen two people of tremendous talent, tremendous ability, but their talents and their abilities have nothing to do with foreign affairs, and they have limited success. Madison in particular is clearly outclassed by the American diplomatic officials, the United States diplomatic officials in England. Slidell has a little more success in France, but even there, it's rather modest. And so the Confederacy is not served well by its foreign policy establishment because it didn't have much of a foreign policy establishment. And the men that they sent over, men of talent and ability, did not have the talent and ability sufficient for the purposes of the Confederate States of America to succeed in getting recognition. On the other hand, the Confederate States of America were particularly blessed by a particular individual by the name of James Dunwoody Bullock. James Dunwoody Bullock. Now there's a name you probably are not that familiar with, and yet he becomes one of the most important, one of the most significant personal figures in the American Civil War. In fact, he does so much harm to the United States of America that when the war is over with, and when the laws of general amnesty are passed, saying if you take the oath of allegiance, you'll be forgiven of your sins, he and his brother, who served on board the CSS Alabama, are specifically exempted. The law specifically says they will under no circumstances be allowed to receive their citizenship. And should they ever return to the United States, they are to be arrested, they are to be tried, and they are to receive the fate of traitors. That's how much damage he's going to do to the United States of America. Who is this James Dunwoody Bullock? And the answer is he was an American naval officer. He is from Georgia. His parents are successful planners. And he has a natural sense as a businessman. And so in the course of sailing for the United States Navy, he makes contacts in Liverpool, which is the place that imports and exports cotton more than any other place. And when the Civil War occurs, he volunteers for the Confederacy. He's made a naval officer, but he's sent to Liverpool as, in essence, a secret agent. And as a secret agent, it's his duty to put together a cabal, a group of people who will negotiate with the British arms manufacturers, who will negotiate with the British ship makers, and he will be highly successful. He will outwit the English neutrality laws. He will work in incredible secrecy. He will purchase almost all of the Enfield rifles that are shipped eventually to the Confederate States of America. He will commission the commerce raiders like the CSS Alabama and the Shenandoah and the Florida. And he will negotiate for the building of the most powerful warships available at the time, the Laird Grahams. And he will do all of this with consummate skill. Where does he get his financing? Well, there was a bank in Liverpool with strong connections to trade in South Carolina that provided almost all the financing and the loans necessary to purchase the arms and armament that the Confederate States of America were giving. And when the war came to an end, Bullock and his brother were specifically mentioned in the amnesty legislation as being exempt. They could not get amnesty. As a result of that, he never came back to the United States. He became a successful cotton importer, quite obviously, and lives a very affluent life in Liverpool until his death. late in the 19th century. And if you'll allow me a short little gee whiz did you know kind of history, his half-sister married the father of Theodore Roosevelt, so that she becomes the mother of the future President Theodore Roosevelt and the grandmother of the future First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt. And if you know anything about Eleanor Roosevelt, you can clearly see that she didn't pass that many genes on, at least to the looks of Eleanor Roosevelt. But she was an amazing person. In fact, some people believe that she was the role model for the creation of the figure Scarlett O'Hara in the novel Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. So Bullock, half-sister, marries into the Roosevelt family, and she becomes the mother of the future President of the United States, and an aunt of another President of the United States, who, by the way, marries his cousin, Eleanor, who is the granddaughter of Martha Bullock. And Roosevelt, by the way, Theodore Roosevelt, was quite proud of this Confederate ancestor of his. He loved the guy's sense of adventure, he loved the fellow's activities with the Navy, first the United States Navy and then the Confederate Navy, and he took great pride in it. That's Theodore Roosevelt. The United States. What's happening in the United States? Well, the United States has the following problems. One, prevent recognition of the Confederacy. Secondly, issues dealing with the fact that it's a regional power. And third, issues dealing with freedom of the seas. Recognition of the Confederacy, quite simply, is Abraham Lincoln issues notice to England and France immediately that England and France must not interfere with the domestic issues of the United States. He said this Civil War is a domestic problem of the United States. Any recognition of the Confederacy, any interference in this war constitutes interference with the domestic policies of the United States. And the consequences of that, he very strongly hinted to England. The consequence of that would be, we will declare war on England, and Canada is at risk. Canada is at risk. The English response, naughty Jonathan. The United States was blessed by having probably the finest diplomatic official in the world representing the United States in England. His name was Charles Francis Adams Sr. He grew up in a family of diplomats, men whose diplomatic experience was exemplary. His grandfather had been the first American ambassador to the court of St. James, which means to England, following the American Revolution. Perhaps you've heard of him. His name was John Adams. Incidentally, he also became the second president of the United States. His father, who was a young boy who accompanied John Adams to England and also accompanied John Adams to France when Adams was negotiating the loans and recognition for the United States from France. John Quincy Adams remained in Europe until he was a grown man, serving in Russia, France, and other places, learning the skills of a diplomat. His father would later become the American Secretary of State under James Monroe. And then when James Monroe finished his administration in 1824, his father also becomes President of the United States as John Quincy Adams. So Charles Francis Adams grew up in a family in which he learned firsthand all of the skills that were necessary to be a first-class diplomat. And more than any other single individual, he kept England from recognizing the Confederate States of America. Now, was he totally successful? Well, he did have his frustrations. And one of his chief frustrations was this rather secretive spy-type character that he could never quite get the proof on that existed up in Liverpool by the name of James Bullock. And so constantly frustrating Charles Francis Adams was this spy versus spy diplomat versus the subversive kind of thing that nobody has ever developed into a miniseries. And I think it would be a tremendous miniseries to discuss the interrelationship between Charles Francis Adams and his game of chess with this Confederate agent up in Liverpool by the name of James Bullock. Monroe Doctrine. That doctrine that says we don't want the Europeans to interfere. Now, while it carries the name Monroe, the person behind the Monroe Doctrine, the person that thought about the Monroe Doctrine, the person that developed the Monroe Doctrine was none other than Charles Francis Adams' father, John Quincy Adams, when he was the American Secretary of State under James Monroe. Now, what happened here was a clever little trick on the part of the British. The British, wanting to frustrate France and Russia, said to the United States, let's cooperate. And we'll both issue a declaration together saying that we won't allow other countries to interfere. And Adams said ultimately, wait a minute, we would be the junior partner. On the other hand, if we declared unilaterally, then all the consequences will affect positively for the United States. And that positively means that we could, in essence, declare that the Western Hemisphere is ours to control. And that's exactly what happened. John Quincy Adams said, unilaterally, it would be more dignified to the United States to allow our principles explicitly than to come in as a cockboat in the wake of a mighty British man of war in 1823. So the United States is committed to this Monroe Doctrine, to this idea that we are the regional powers and other people should stay out. And of course, among those, the England and France under Napoleon III, who will have this Mexican adventure all during the war. Freedom of the seas. That's important. But that interferes with something called the blockade. In order to defeat the Confederacy, there's a thing called the Anaconda Plan, which we're going to talk about next week, or next session, not next week, but next session. But a major part of the Anaconda Plan was to blockade, to strangle from international trade the Confederate States of America. Sounds important, sounds good. But there were three major problems. First, you cannot blockade your own country. International law says that. In other words, you only blockade another country. So that when Lincoln blockaded the states of the Confederate States of America, in the wise eyes of the world, he was by de facto recognizing the Confederate States of America as an independent country. And England took advantage of that. England wasn't quite ready to risk the loss of Canada, but England immediately gave belligerent status to the Confederacy. That's just a hair short of recognizing the Confederacy as an independent country. It recognizes the Confederacy is in a state of war against the United States. And because they recognized that, they were able to yeah, no permission. That became important. Well, there's also an issue of a paper blockade, which I think I can better explain in a future lecture. But again, the United States didn't have the military, didn't have the Navy to do it. And England, but England had created a paper blockade. The United States had not recognized that. So England won a point here. They recognized the blockade. And in the future wars, the United States would have to recognize what's called a paper blockade that England would do, hence in World War I. But most importantly is the idea of transshipment. I'm going to save till later the explanation of transshipment, but basically transshipment determines where you can board another ship. You can stop direct trade, that's shipment. But what about indirect trade, where trade goes to a neutral place and then else? Can you stop the trade going to the neutral place? And the neutral place is the first leg of a transshipment. That sounds confusing, it's not. But as a result of that, the English were sending war supplies not to the United States. They never did that. They sent the war supplies to Nassau in Panama. Excuse me, Nassau in the Bahamas. And all of a sudden, this insignificant little set of islands became one of the biggest importers of war supplies and exporters of cotton in the world. And once those imports and exports left the Bahamas going to the United States, then they had to run the blockade. But getting there, which was an easy blockade journey across, that's the transshipment. And the United States ultimately gave in on that point. Previously, the United States had said transshipment is freedom of the seas. Freedom of the seas, remember the Chesapeake Leopard affair? Well, in November the 8th, 1861, the United States had the Trent affair, where an American warship stopped the British mail packet Trent and pulled off 2 diplomatic officials and arrested them. Very popular in the United States. The public loved it. But after a few months of negotiating and threats of war from England, the United States had to say, we believe that the United States was wrong. We did the same thing with the Trent that you guys never have apologized for doing with the Chesapeake. And Lincoln ordered the diplomats that had been arrested released, and they went on, one to England, the other to France, where in point of fact, they probably did more harm than good. But in that case, freedom of the seas was upheld by Lincoln, and the British acknowledged freedom of the seas for the first time. A quick coda, the Taipei Rebellion. I wanted to talk about it, where time is running out, but there was this other civil war. What I will say about that other civil war, you ought to look it up. And by the way, when I send the PDF out, I'm going to add some material, including material on this other civil war. But that civil war that occurred in China led to somewhere between 20 and 30 million people dying, most of starvation, but many by war. And it affected the United States and other places because so many Chinese fled China that among the workers building the Transcontinental Railroad, appearing in the silver and gold fields in America, were hordes and hordes of Chinese that would impact the growing population, the Asian population, not only of the New World, but of Southeast Asia and other parts of the world as well. And so there you have it, a rather worldwide impact of the American Civil War. We're going to build future lectures in part from this material. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm getting messages from Misha. Our time is running short. So I'm going to turn it over for 1 or 2 quick questions if we have time. Okay, Misha.
We have time for a couple of questions
Okay.
if anybody has anything. Yes,
Well,
no? If anybody thinks of any questions, you can always email me and I can get them to Fred, or just ask next time. And wanted to thank everybody for coming. I appreciate you guys, and we appreciate your support for OLLI. And I hope to see you.
Allie,
Yes,
not Allie. Allie's my daughter-in-law, Misha. One quick thing on the Taipei Rebellion. Today, we see the Chinese government, which is a Marxist government, an atheist government, but they are very concerned about movements, especially religious movements, even some movements that look like more like physical exercise. And the reason they're concerned about it is because of this Taipei Rebellion, that when an odd foreign movement gets started in China, it often results in the deaths, not of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but of millions of people. And so some of the things you see going on in China definitely has to do with Marxism. But some of the things, and religious suppression is among them, that you see going on in China, goes back to this Taipei Rebellion that had a tremendous element of religion connected to it and religious fanaticism connected to it, and 20 to 30 million people died. That's enough. Thank you all.
thank you, Fred. And we will see you all next time. Have a blessed day.
Bye-bye.